Hi, my name is Steven and welcome back to my channel. And today I'm going to be talking to you about my top 5 failures in life, my biggest regrets and lessons learned. We all at some point in our lives experience failures. It's important for us to bounce back and figure out what our mistakes were, to ultimately overcome them and take the lessons learned into the future. The wisest among us keeps our failures within an arm's length distance from us. This means that we can still take the lessons learned from that experience, but not have it overwhelm us in our day-to-day activities. Only by reflecting on our past and learning from the mistakes can we do better in the future. As someone who values personal growth and development, learning from my failures has been a big lesson for me in my life. I believe that it's important for us to examine honestly and intentionally the past failures of our lives. While none of my failures were catastrophic in my life, they did force me to become an overall better person. By examining these failures and reflecting upon them, I can be a better individual. Throughout my experiences, I'm going to share with you the biggest failures of my life and how it ultimately made me a better person from it, and how it forced me to face the realities of that situation and ultimately find a path through it. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about my background, my top failures, and my general thoughts. And before we start, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, share with friends, hit that notification bell if you like this content. And let's do this. Failures are a natural part of life, and how you respond to them can significantly impact your future. Our brains are wired to be more sensitive to negative experiences rather than positive ones, which means that failures can ultimately have more impact on our lives than successes can. When something bad happens in our lives, our minds can get stuck and we can get overwhelmed by the situation. However, it is important to take a step back and reflect on that failure once you're able to, and ultimately move forward and learn from that experience. This moment of pause can give us time to process our emotions and understand what happened in that situation. In many cases, failures can provide us with valuable information that we can take with us into the future and help us improve and better different aspects of our lives to ultimately avoid similar situations in the future where you can fail as well. The reflective process can be challenging and time intensive, but it's absolutely necessary. And it is absolutely essential for your personal growth and development. It's also important to note that failure in itself is not always a bad thing. It can be an opportunity for growth, and it also could lead to different opportunities that you otherwise might not have seen. By also reframing our perspective about failure, we can ultimately gain more from it. We can learn to embrace it and become part of our natural life, and it can propel us forward into success. So here are my top failures in no particular order. Here are my top 5 failures in life. Number 1, lack of effort in school. If there is one thing I can tell my younger self to do, is to study and focus more in school. This would pertain to my middle school and high school days. I was really distracted by video games at the time, and I didn't see what the point of school was. And it also didn't help that I didn't have socially positive experiences at that time. As I look back on it now, because I didn't do well in school, it had profound impacts on the rest of my life. For those 4 years that I didn't do very well in high school, it has impacted me even to this day. Classes build and compound on each other, so if you didn't do well or didn't learn well in one class, it affected you in future classes. And the worse I did, the more I needed to catch up, especially in my advanced mathematics classes. This was also especially true for my English and computer classes. My overall lack of effort impacted my grades and the schools that I was able to get into in college. And because I got into a lower tier school, that impacted what jobs I would get when I graduated in the recession. So that lack of effort impact really transformed my trajectory in life because of what I did in high school. Even though it was almost 18 years ago when I graduated high school, it's silly to me that it still impacts my life today. I really wish that I ultimately had a better selection of colleges and jobs later down the line. But this failure in high school really led me to recognize that I needed to step up for my college years. I really put in a huge amount of effort during my college years to try to make up for the high school years. This meant that I had to reverse a lot of the bad habits that I picked up during high school. Ultimately, that drive, motivation, and chip on my shoulder led me to where I am today. So as much as I thought I was a failure back in high school, it did lead me to a better role eventually. Number 2, finding a job after school. As I alluded to earlier, because of my middling grades in high school and college, I did not find a job after I graduated from college. Especially in the hyper-competitive fields such as engineering, I just didn't stand out enough. This was further compounded because I graduated at the height of the Great Recession in 2009. It was overall a bad time for me and I felt like a failure. Although some of my peers did get jobs, I was deeply envious and jealous of them. Jobs were slim pickings and I didn't get to the second round of any interview. During this time, I had to think very outside of the box to try to get myself in any kind of job related to STEM fields. So I branched out and solicited a whole bunch of volunteering positions in university laboratories. I was able to eventually get a lab assistant position at a university that provided me with some income. It was around that time that because of my failure to get a job, I decided to go for a master's or PhD. Because the people around me at the time were all in PhD programs and I wanted to get on that train as well. I think for me, not finding a job straight out of school was the most formulative failure in my life. I could have easily did nothing, stayed at home with my parents, and tried to get a minimum job somewhere. Even with the Bachelor's of Science, I didn't have enough to get into some of the Master's and PhD programs in the area. But because I was able to get a lab assistant position at a prestigious university, that was the kick that I needed to get into some of these Master's and PhD programs. This failure was the first to force me into fighting tooth and nail for my future. And this experience of fighting for it and getting what I want, it became the basis for my personality style for the future. Number 3, giving up on a PhD. Near the end of my master's degree, I had a chance to pursue my PhD dream or get a job in the industry. I chose to quit the PhD dream and go straight to work. I saw this as a really tough decision in which I failed to get my PhD. In hindsight, it was the right call to make to jump into a job, especially during the financial situation of the economy at the time. But at the time, it nevertheless stung like hell. While working as a lab assistant, I was surrounded by PhD students all the time, and they kind of brainwashed me into thinking I needed a PhD. I knew that the PhD path would be extremely difficult for me and time consuming. But at the time, I think I needed a PhD more for my ego and status. And I also knew that when I started working, I would formally quit school forever. I felt like schooling up to that point is all I knew, and giving that up felt like a failure, especially to start an industry job in which I knew very, very little of. And that wasn't the only change. I had to move cities and upend my life during that time. But I had to make that choice because logically it was the right move given the job market. Years later, I think that if I made it through the PhD program, it would have had significant cost impacts on my life, both from a time and personal perspective. I would have not had time to develop the social skills or have fun in my 20s. And I also would have graduated overqualified in a shaky job market. Looking back on it now, I don't think it was worth it to get the PhD, but at the time, it felt like a massive failure to quit school and start something completely new, because it wasn't what I started and set out to do at the time. Number 4, quitting Silicon Valley. After moving to Silicon Valley for my new job, I struggled to establish myself for 3 years there. I was treading water there with my finances, social networks, and dating. And I ultimately realized that I just didn't fit in with the techies that lived there. I really felt out of place and I made few friends during that time. I personally just didn't have the it factor to make it there. So when a new job opportunity opened up in Seattle, I had to take the opportunity to go there. Quitting San Francisco and the Silicon Valley felt like a major failure and defeat for me. I didn't make it and I just didn't adjust to the area very well. That was on top of the very high cost of living area that I was in. Now that I look back on it, it still stings that I had to move out of California in the first place. Had the cost of living been lower, dating a little bit easier, and friends a little bit cooler, maybe I would have stayed in San Francisco. But I think the combination of all the negative aspects of it forced me to quit and move to somewhere else. I do miss California every so often, but I wouldn't trade it at all now for the life I have in Seattle. Because ultimately that failure turned into something great somewhere else, taking the lessons I learned from San Francisco and applying it directly to Seattle. And number 5, lack of hobbies. This is a catch-all failure to encompass my childhood to my mid-20s, which is I had a lack of hobbies during those times. I consider this one of my biggest failures because it impacted almost every aspect of my current life. You see, as a child, my hobbies consisted of playing video games, and just video games. I didn't really develop any other skills creatively, socially, or sports-wise. This meant that I really limited my options when it comes to connecting to other people during my childhood through my mid-20s. Because I didn't really connect with people with different hobbies. I only connected with people who played video games, and those people were also very self-isolating. Over time, this resulted in a lot less closer relationships that I otherwise would have had if I had more hobbies, more social networks. And per Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule to be a master at something, I didn't really get good at anything else besides playing video games. And this didn't really help me advance in any other part of my life. I wasted a tremendous amount of time not developing a creative skill, a musical skill, or playing sports with other people. I lost a lot of time in what could have been more productive hobbies that I could have taken with me into the future of my life. As I started to get more money and time during my mid-20s, I dedicated more of my time to finding out new hobbies. And through this time, I'm able to gain a lot of skills through the various hobbies that I have. I think now, present day, my persistence to pursue hobbies has benefited me greatly. As more people are inundated with less time and family and work obligations, I'm crafting more time for myself to hobbies. And I'm making it a priority in life because I didn't in my childhood to my mid-20s. This means that ultimately I'm making up for that lost time and I'm prioritizing hobbies into the future of my life, so that ultimately I'll be able to continuously gain skills for the foreseeable future. So here are my general thoughts on my failures. The bulk of my failures were related to school, and on a whole, I don't think school was very beneficial for me. There were many arbitrary failure points, and the school system was very rigid by nature. This means that in order to be very good at school, I had to jump through very specific and arbitrary loops all the time, and ultimately come out of the other side with a high-paying job and status. For the majority of my childhood, I just couldn't focus on school because the topics I was learning weren't interesting to me. And in hindsight, a small fraction of what I learned in school actually applies to me in real life. This also applies to my engineering job even to this day. The vast majority of the skill sets that I needed to be successful in engineering weren't taught to me by school. Only the specialized topics that I used for my job were useful to me. The rest of them I didn't really use. So unless I was required to, I don't think I would subject myself to formal schooling in the future. And lastly, with all of my failures, each one of them hurt, and I took a long time to process them individually. And getting the confidence to finally move forward took a lot of mental time and energy from me. It was never something I easily moved on from. Time just lessened the pain. The only thing that I do keep from those failures was the lessons that I learned and continue to learn from those failures. Because if I forget the past, I might be doomed to repeat it in the future. So those were my top 5 failures in life. We humans are very fallible creatures that do occasionally fail at things. And only by reflecting on them and carrying the lessons that we learn from it can we move forward and better ourselves in the future. My failures, as painful as they were, made me a tougher and more resilient person going forward. Had I been successful at every turn, I wouldn't have learned critical lessons learned that made me who I am today. So I hope you're able to gain some insight into my failures and how that forged who I am today. So thank you for watching. Please leave me a comment down below on what was one of your failures and how did that change your life. And I'll see you next time.